Classic anime is awesome. There's just something about that old school aesthetic that really hooks me, and as such, I've watched a lot of OVAs. Now, in case you're not a shut-in nerd like me, OVA stands for Original Video Animation. They were direct-to-VHS anime with less creative restrictions and censorship than what you'd see on TV. In other words, they're the shit. This, in my mind, was the golden era of not just Japanese animation, but animation in general, where we got some of the weirdest and wildest shit ever put to screen, a lot of which you'll probably never see anything like again. The way I discovered a lot of these OVAs was through a channel called Marvelous Videos. While nowadays they're one of those AI thumbnail shitty clickbait channels, they did at one point put out a few decent OVA lists, which I really owe for getting me started on my journey back in the day. And one of the shows I remember them mentioning was Genocyber. Now, my memories are foggy, so I don't know if they said it was good or not, but I just recall seeing cool monsters and hearing it was ultra-violent. But the thing is, I just never watched it for some reason. But later I was going through some random OVA playlist and I saw Genocyber pop up and thought, oh, alright, I'll give that a watch. And by the end, I was just wishing I had seen it sooner, because this shit is awesome, and in this video I'm gonna tell you why. Genocyber is a 5-part series directed by Koichi Ohata that's brought to us by Artmic. And in researching this video, I also found out they made a ton of other great OVAs I love like Bubblegum Crisis, Megazone 23, and Dragon's Heaven. Ohata was one of Artmic's many alumni, and mainly worked as a storyboard artist and mechanical designer on stuff like Angel Cop, Gunbuster, and more OVAs I'll probably do videos on at some point. Whereas more recently, he's done storyboards for Redo of Healer. How the Mighty Have Fallen. The important thing is that he had never written or directed anything before except for a pretty bad but unintentionally funny OVA called Cybernetics Guardian.
Freeze! Stop right there. Don't even try and breathe.
Which sure does explain some shit, but we'll get to that. Genocyber itself is based on an unfinished manga by Tony Takazaki, who had previously worked with Artmic on Bubblegum Crisis, which is fucking fire by the way. Like I said, it's unfinished, and after the initial 5 issues, the story just stops. Not that it really matters though, since the OVA is about as faithful to the source material as Skybound Shockwave. The only thing they really have in common is weird body horror tech, a few similar designs, the Genocyber name and general concept, a few characters with the same names, and the basic roles they play in the manga. But those connections are only really present in the first episode, and past that it very much becomes its own thing. If anything, the manga is more like a loose prequel, since it kind of serves as a fleshed out version of events that seem to have happened off-screen in the show. Again, emphasis on loose. There's no real way they could exist in the same universe due to all the weird differences. Most of the information I'm about to give you about the show's development comes from this article on Zimmerit.mo. It doesn't have sources for everything, but most of the information seems fairly reliable, and I couldn't find a better English resource for the show's development. I'd recommend reading some of the article yourself if you want to know the full story, but here's the long and short of it. Apparently, Genocyber was supposed to have been a live-action project, but development shifted to animation instead. In addition, it seems Ohata had free reign to do whatever the fuck he wanted to do since the manga was so lacking in content, which, again, explains some stuff. Now, one more thing before I actually get into the series itself. Like with most things I review on this channel, if you haven't seen this, I'd recommend checking it out first. You can find it pretty much everywhere. If you read the disclaimer though, you know viewer discretion is advised. I think Ohata or someone else working on Genocyber just fucking despises children because all of them die horrifically in this show. However, I should also note I'm not dumb. I know there's maybe like one guy who will actually honor this request, but the good news is I don't think knowing the story will really impact your viewing experience. Genocyber's story is told over 3 parts, so I'm gonna review each individual storyline because reviewing it as a whole would be kinda disjointed. There's a lot of vast time jumps, and each plotline is kind of its own thing with the Genocyber creature as a connecting thread. And I'm sure you're wondering at this point just what the hell a Genocyber is, so here you go. A scientist named Dr. Morgan has discovered a way to tap into Vajra, which is basically chi except it involves a lot more body horror. Speaking of which, since this guy is a scientist, he naturally decides to use his 2 unborn children as test subjects to try and awaken their inner Vajra. What could go wrong? Well, his lab assistant Kenneth thinks to himself, scientific discovery of the century, huh? That sounds pretty awesome. It'd be nice if I could have that, and it'd be a shame if you, died, since I'm the only one who really knows about it and I could just take all the credit. And so he sells out Morgan to the Kiryu Group, who are basically every evil bioweapons corporation. They kill Morgan and hand over his daughters and research to Kenneth, who tries to convince the children they're his kids to ensure their loyalty. The twins are Elaine and Diana, who are both powerful psychics. Diana is the weaker of the two and had to be given a cyborg body to make up for birth defects, while Elaine is essentially a wild animal with Professor X powers. And I'm sure you can already see the problem here. Elaine knows Kenneth is full of shit and escapes into the streets, where she befriends a kid named Rat. From there, everyone's trying to retrieve Elaine, and to make a long story short, in the process, her and Rat get killed. However, Elaine dying allows her to merge her mind with Diana, and when the two fuse, they become Genocyber. Fueled by Elaine's sadness over Rat's death, Genocyber then proceeds to completely destroy Hong Kong. Now, I want to get one of the big criticisms I see of this show out of the way, which is that the characters aren't exactly great. Elaine has the literal brain of an animal, but she's akin to a character like Frankenstein, where she's more of a misunderstood, tormented, and curious creature. Her sister Diana is shown to be quite dedicated to Kenneth, since he's the only person she's ever really known. Although whenever she does question him, let's just say he has ways of keeping her in line. These two are pretty much the only overarching characters we have for the series, but the first episode is the most characterization we get out of them. Especially Diana, who's extremely jealous of Elaine and is generally pretty sadistic. Now, like I said, the story is broken up into 3 separate parts, with Genocyber being the connecting thread. Each of these parts has a different lead, and because of this, I wouldn't say any of them got the amount of screen time they needed to really get fleshed out. But here's the thing though, when it comes to OVAs, I rarely give a fuck about the characters that much anyway. I'm not saying there aren't OVAs with great characters, but typically I'm watching these because I like the crazy concept, the action, or animation. And despite its flaws, I was still fairly engaged in the series' story because it kept a steady flow of pretty interesting concepts and cool sequences. Sure, the characters aren't particularly fascinating, but I don't feel like they have to be. When you're watching something akin to Friday the 13th or certain Godzilla movies, it's fine if the characters aren't deep or anything, as long as they aren't annoying to watch and are generally likable. Because these kinds of leads are really there to get you from one monster scene to another, and they serve that purpose fine in this show. And with how the plot is broken up into smaller stories, it meant that none of them ever overstayed their welcome. Not every story needs great characters, and sure, this show could have used some better ones, but I felt like it gave me enough to at least not find any of them completely boring. The actual plot is fairly engaging, but there are points where it can be hard to tell just what the fuck is going on. I feel like a lot of Japanese exposition just has a really fucking weird way of explaining things. Like, I can't describe it perfectly, but it brings to mind my years in math class where I hear the words and technically I do understand what's being said, but the second I start to actually think about it more, my mind would go fucking blank. This show definitely has a lot of those moments, but I'm the kind of guy who doesn't really care too much about deep explanations. Like, for example, Vajra and what Genocyber really is in more technical terms. I mean, yeah, it'd be nice to know, but then you might end up with some midichlorian shit. Although, overall, the world building is definitely a bit weak at times. The world Genocyber paints in each of its stories is a pretty interesting one, but it only feels like we ever get glimpses into it. The Kiryu Group, for example. I really don't know anything about them other than the fact that they make bioweapons and are evil. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking. Well, damn, that first episode sounds like it's mid at best. Why the fuck are you hyping up this shit so much? Well, let's get into it. First of all, despite it being vague at times, the setting of Genocyber is pretty fascinating. All of the ideas here are so wild, and at least from an action standpoint, the show rarely disappoints with them. In terms of visuals, I also want to point out something really weird you'll probably notice in this footage. Remember when I said Genocyber was initially conceived as a live-action series? Well, it seems like some models may have been constructed, or at least they wanted to carry over part of that concept. Since there's a lot of weird mixed media stuff in the first episode, it regularly cuts to models for some shots, and there's also some kinda uncanny distorted photos thrown in as well. I recall being so fucking confused as to why this was in the show at first, but now it makes more sense. And honestly, I think it gives this first episode a really unique and at times creepy vibe that the other ones are lacking. That's the funny thing, some people say this is a horror show, and while it definitely has a lot of Cronenberg-type shit and some spooky sequences, it's really more akin to Guyver, where it's a tokusatsu show with a body horror sheen, especially as it goes on. The show sometimes tries to do more atmospheric and creepy sequences, but I wish they kept this weird style past episode 1, because it's kinda cool. Sadly, there's been no HD version, so the best most people can get are all these shitty rips on YouTube that you're seeing right now. Despite that though, it's in much better shape than others. Now, it's not the most technically impressive, but it's got style. And the main praise I can give it is how fucking awesome the actual visuals are. The designs in this series are some of the coolest I've ever seen in an old OVA. I love weird biotech shit, and this show delivers the goods when it comes to that. I honestly can't pick a favorite design because they're all so awesome. Although Diana's mech suit in this episode and the Vajranoid in the next are definitely up there. I mean, I'm biased since I like almost all anime in this style, but a lot of the set pieces and designs are what elevates it for me so much. Just in this first episode alone, you get this creepy hospital sequence, Genocyber's attack on Hong Kong, and these freaky biomutants sent by the Kiryu group. This is definitely a series that's more about the experience and craziness rather than the exact execution. The music is also pretty good. I mean, it's not the most memorable score or anything, but there were a few catchy enough tracks. The last main praise I can bring up before getting deeper into the show is its themes. Or at least what I think its themes are. Again, there's not a ton of resources on old niche OVAs from the 90s. So in the end, a lot of this is my interpretation, and I could be giving the show more credit than it deserves, but here we go. The word I most often hear used to describe Genocyber is nihilistic. And that's a tone that I think is really tough to handle. I can think of a few examples that explore it in a more interesting way, but usually I find it to be edgy bullshit with no bigger point than, "Oh, mankind sucks." But I think Genocyber, despite its flaws, has a decent narrative at its core that handles these themes pretty well. And this moment right here is where it shines through.
ここだよ。もう一緒に遊べないんだ。楽しかったのにね。あんなに楽しかったの生まれて初めてさ。でももう行かなきゃ。お姉ちゃんのこと大好きだよ。さよなら。さよなら。
That shit is fucking sad, and it hits hard. Well, for me at least. Because even though this episode is short, we see that both Rat and Elaine are outcasts who haven't really known love or kindness, and when they become friends, she seems to be in a peaceful state. Elaine isn't some dangerous monster. Left to her own devices, she just wants to play. The only reason she becomes one is that the world just wouldn't let her find peace. Whether it's street punks, Kenneth, or Kiryu, someone is always coming in to ruin her life. And to me, that's what Elaine's story seems to be about, a loss of innocence. If she had just been left to her own devices to live with Rat, she might have never even been a threat or turned into Genocyber. But the world around her was just too shitty to allow for that. I do enjoy these kinds of tales, as bleak as they are. Maybe because I'm just too cynical and jaded myself. This is a monster born of man in every sense of the word. And you do have to wonder, did they bring it on themselves? Despite all its flaws, there's a lot of moments like this in the show that really stuck with me, and it's one of the things that makes it kind of hard to review, because this is all stuff that's been shaped by my experiences over life, so these moments may not impact you in the same way. Episodes 2 and 3 follow a reborn Elaine who's taken in by the crew of a special battleship called the Alexandria during wartime. Oh hey, and the Kiryu group is involved, big shocker. Elaine is picked up after a bunch of her friends get killed and befriends Myra, who's the ship's doctor. Myra takes Elaine in as a daughter and ends up calling her Laura after her real daughter who died in a plane crash. Also on board the ship is a mad scientist funded by Kiryu named Sakamitsu, who's created a bioweapon called the Vajranoid, clearly based on Morgan's research. The Vajranoid starts going crazy around Elaine, and Sakamitsu is able to get a piece of Genocyber to reverse engineer. The entire ship is then assimilated into a John Carpenter-esque monstrosity, which Elaine destroys when she turns into Genocyber. However, that was only the beginning, as Genocyber then embarks on a global reign of terror across the planet. By the way, in case you're confused as to why Elaine has a cyborg body now, it's never said outright, but it seems fairly obvious it's because of the fusion with Diana, since she also had a cyborg body. Now, if the first episode wasn't gruesome enough, these episodes are where shit gets even more brutal. Once again, Elaine is shown to be virtually harmless until legitimately provoked, because all of these people just can't leave her the fuck alone. Myra is definitely the weakest of the protagonists. I mean, her relationship with Elaine is kind of wholesome, but the problem is that it shouldn't be, and the show never really does anything with that. It turns out Laura was actually killed by Genocyber during the Hong Kong attack. Now, there was a plane destroyed in the first one, but it wasn't that one. So don't get confused like I was. Because, yeah, that seems like the most obvious bit of continuity to carry over. The problem is that the show doesn't do shit with this. She never finds out, and by the end she's completely lost her mind. Now, I did like that conclusion to her character, since honestly, if you saw this shit... there's no way you wouldn't go fucking crazy. But aside from this, there's nothing really going for her. I mean, she's fine, I guess. I remember scenes she's in, and I wasn't that bored by her, but still. What makes up for this, though, is that the rest of these two episodes are awesome. The isolated boat setting lends itself well to some horror set pieces. And this episode definitely has some of the most gnarly but awesome transformations and mutations in the entire show. There's a gradual creepy build-up throughout the first part that culminates in the madness we get by the end. And credit where credit's due, they did a decent job of showing all the crewmates interacting and building them up. I mean, again, they aren't deep, but I felt like their personalities and relationships were established well enough that it made the finale even more horrific since you know a little more about them. Sakamitsu is the real star of the show, though. Watching his slow descent into madness as he realized how inferior his Vajranoid is to Genocyber, and his following crusade to become a weird god creature was fun, and again it led to some awesome set pieces. But while the build-up is great, I guess it would be unfair to expect he'd actually last in a fight with Genocyber. I don't know, though. I was hoping he'd last more than 2 seconds after all that big talk. I swear I wrote that without any innuendo in mind, it just kinda happened. Ah, fuck, never mind, that just made it worse. The only major downside to these episodes, aside from the weak lead, is that there's a lot less to talk about, since this one didn't really impact me as much. Like I said, awesome visuals, action, and body horror, and the crew is likable enough. I also love that right after it seems like Genocyber has saved the day, it just becomes the new threat and goes on a rampage. Which leads nicely into the next part of the story. The city of Arctigrand is the final storyline of Genocyber, and first of all, let me just get this out of the way.
Just unbelievable. How did we come to this? For 100 years we have fought you. A battle that will only end with humanity's destruction. Who the hell are you? I can't understand your existence. When did it happen? Who brought forth such a creature with the awesome powers of destruction you possess?
You know, the dub is mostly tolerable. Although, to be fair, I'm a hardened man when it comes to this shit, so my gauge for judging it is kind of off.
What do you make of these?
These? Seems to be energy resources.
Like, it's not great in the first 3 episodes, but it's serviceable. I can remember a few of the performances, and most of the voices fit okay. But then you get to this shit.
Any and all reason in knowing is gone now, beyond the present reality. However, as the unquestioned leader of the Kuryu group, no, as representative for all humanity, I shall send you a final challenger.
Not only is the dialogue here laughable, but it's being delivered by one of the staff's old dads who's never read a script in his life. And this reflects the general quality of the dub for the next 2 episodes, as well as the overall quality of those actual episodes. Arctigrand is often regarded as the worst part of this show, and I can definitely see why. So it turns out Genocyber went to war with Earth, wiping out most of the population and leaving a lot of it in ruins. Our leads for these episodes are Mel and Ryu. Mel is a blind woman with psychic abilities, while Ryu is a kind-hearted guy who's also an expert at hitting targets with knives. They've come to the city of Arctigrand to try and earn enough money to afford an operation that will fix Mel's sight. The only thing is, Ryu is a dumbass and took a deal from someone who looks like the shadiest man alive. Arctigrand is super corrupt, and the rich rule over it while the poor continue to suffer. They use Ryu to kill a guy for their amusement, but before they can silence him, he flees and takes Mel to the underground where they fall unconscious. Now, I know I said I was going to keep the descriptions light, but this next scene is such a pinnacle of stupidity that I need to mention it. Ryu awakens before Mel in a dazed state and somehow misses her, but manages to successfully wander out of these dangerous tunnels and onto the street intact while still delirious.
Oh, how did I end up over here anyway?
He then just happens to pass a terrorist at the perfect moment for him to slip a detonator into his pocket to frame him for a crime. This leads to his arrest, despite the fact that the city guard was already looking for him. Damn, man, this guy and Elaine, they just can't catch a break, can they? Mel, on the other hand, is taken in by underground religious hobos who are worshipping the ancient remains of Genocyber. The mayor, Crimson Rockwell, doesn't like this, and so he has them and Mel killed. Mel's psychic abilities seem to let her live on, and she lends her power to awaken Genocyber in an even more powerful new form, which then destroys the city. And then the rest of the ending happens, and yeah, I don't really know what happens here. I guess the Kiryu group built Deathsaurus' fortress to try and kill Genocyber, which then blows up. Mel and Ryu then awaken fine, and it seems like Elaine or Diana or both have been reincarnated into a baby. Now, I bet that sounds kinda bad, and you're right, it is from a more objective standpoint. But here's the thing. I like this storyline a lot regardless. First of all, I actually cared about Ryu and Mel. They established their relationship enough, and I was rooting for them. Again, no one in this show is Shakespeare, but I was pleasantly surprised after hearing how much this part sucked to find myself actually caring about these two because they had a solid goal I could get behind. Also, it's a little hokey, but I like the setup of Ryu and his desperation getting drawn into this creepy Eyes Wide Shut club where all this shit goes down, only to find out these assholes were just using him as a bit of entertainment and never intended to pay him. Past its flaws like weird coincidences and hokey explanations, this feels like the perfect thematic crescendo to Genocyber. I'm a big fan of these mega-city settings like FF7 or Metropolis, so I was happy to see one pop up in this show. The behind-the-scenes politics, the whole mythology of it being built on the ruins of an older city, it felt decently fleshed out and I thought it was cool. But also, I like that the final enemy isn't some crazy monster. It's humanity. In the end, Genocyber cannot rest because mankind's sins continue to awaken it. The format of this show ended up reminding me of something I doubt many of you have ever seen, that being the Daimajin series. These movies center around a living stone samurai statue called Daimajin that comes to life to punish sinners. The films follow a pretty basic formula. An evil guy is doing something that harms or kills innocents, and Daimajin awakens to deal with him. I think the angry god comparison the show makes is an apt one, and that's another really cool concept. The idea of Genocyber being worshipped as a god in the future and having a mythology around it. I love how epic the scope is here, where we get to see how this monstrous new life form affects civilization over the years. And yet, no matter how many times it appears, these constants continue to awaken it. Also, just a little side note, but it's weird that Diana becomes the peaceful one in these episodes. I mean, it makes sense for Elaine to be more vengeful by this point, but I don't know. If you ask me, Diana always seemed like kind of a bitch. But whatever, people can change over a couple hundred years. Genocyber's new design is also sick. Just when I was starting to get worried that these last two episodes wouldn't have a new design, the show swooped in with this badass. Genocyber is absent a lot because they're really building up its comeback, and the actual scene where it does return is worth the wait. After how much they build up Rockwell as just the most evil bastard ever, it's pretty satisfying to see him and his rotten city get wiped out in a kaiju attack. Now, I will admit the ending is kinda dumb, mainly because this death satellite thing is barely explained. Again, I don't need it all spelled out for me, but everything just kinda happens and there's no real context. Honestly, I have no idea what really happened except that Mel and Ryu made it out alive. And you know what? I like that. Because I think if the show had just ended on a note like the first episode, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much. After all this horrible shit that happens, it feels kinda fitting to have a slightly more hopeful ending. The world is still in ruin, but as dark and depressing as it may be, these two might just be able to live happily together. And that's what I found kind of funny about Genocyber. The fact that Elaine isn't some violent monster, but just someone who wants to have fun and be loved, well, in the first few episodes at least, I think shows that Genocyber isn't trying to say everyone's evil to their core or anything, or that there's no hope at all. And that, in the end, is why I wouldn't say this show is as hopeless as some people make it out to be. Things can be incredibly grim and nihilistic. Sometimes good people die for no reason, and the world is shown most of the time to be an incredibly cruel and unforgiving place. But in spite of that, there's always someone worth saving, or at least trying to save. This show is basically Artmic's last hurrah as they went bankrupt afterwards. Now, some say it's a shit stain on their legacy, but I disagree. It's not perfect, but damn is it entertaining. It's a deeply flawed work, but at the same time, I've seen plenty of stuff that would be considered objectively better that didn't leave as much of an impact on me. And that's because the show was trying something crazy. It didn't completely work out, but the result is special nonetheless. It's a show that, despite all of its issues, has so many great concepts and still manages to execute them well enough at times. Not just that, but the show actually made me feel something, and I'm not just talking about the shock value of the violence. Remakes are generally pointless, but taking something flawed like this with a lot of potential and giving it another chance is something I wish more people would do. But what am I saying? That money needs to go to 8 more Star Wars movies that are the exact fucking same slop and don't do anything interesting. What was I thinking? In all seriousness, I love Genocyber as it is, but yeah, it's flawed. And I would like to see a version that expands more on the story and fixes some of these issues. But, you know, the flaws are kind of part of the experience with this one, as retarded as that may sound. If you enjoy stuff like Guyver that's a weird mix of tokusatsu and body horror, you'll probably like this series overall. And who knows, maybe you'll appreciate some of the stuff I did. If you made it this far and are still interested, check it out. It's pretty good.